Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Arixmethes, Slumbering Isle. As usual, I've designed this deck to cost less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including basic lands at 10 cents each, but not including the cost of shipping or taxes and the like. But let's get into this deck. So our commander is Arixmethes, Slumbering Isle, a 12/12 legendary Kraken that costs 2 generic, a green, and a blue to cast, and enters the battlefield tapped with 5 slumber counters on it. Arixmethes is a land that taps for a green and a blue mana, so long as there are slumber counters on it, and is specifically not a creature when this is the case. But you may remove a slumber counter whenever you cast a spell, and is an incredibly large mana dork when there are no slumber counters on it. So Arixmethes has a reasonable mana cost for a commander, being able to get it out fairly early, say like turn 3 or 4. But Arixmethes also only acts as ramp for the first few turns that it's out, though it does help you cast spells to get the slumber counters off of it. But that's enough around the commander. Let's take a look at how we'll build around it and go over some of the goals this deck looks to achieve. To start, we're going to have a bunch of low to the ground spells so that we can remove slumber counters off of Arixmethes relatively quickly, as a large amount of our damage will be centered around having Arixmethes as a creature. We'll also look to add in a bunch of spells that can give combat-based keywords to make our 12/12 commander scarier and more likely to get through on an opponent. We'll also want to have a few pieces of protection for our commander since, while it has a fairly reasonable mana cost, needing to cast 5 spells to get slumber counters off can be a bit of an investment that we'd prefer not to pay multiple times in a game. But we'll also have a few additional large and or evasive creatures that can put pressure on opponents in case Arixmethes goes down for some time. But overall, this deck is mostly looking for combat damage wins, and while not exactly Voltron, knocking an opponent out with commander damage is certainly in the cards. But that's enough of a preamble. Let's start digging into our 99, starting with our ramp. I'll start by going over some land-based ramp, including Wayfarer's Bauble, Font of Fertility, an Embodiment of Spring, permanents that can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Rampant Growth tutors a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and Kodama's Reach and Cultivate are reskins of each other, tutoring and revealing 2 basic lands, one of which you put onto the battlefield tapped, and the other goes into your hand. Then for some mana rocks, we have Mindstone, Moss Diamond, and Sky Diamond, tapping for generic, green, and blue mana respectively. Felwar Stone is likely to tap for green and or blue, and Arcane Signet will tap for green or blue. And we have a couple of mana dorks, with Ornithopter of Paradise tapping for any colored mana, and Gyre Engineer giving a blue and a green mana when tapped. And now that we have a bunch of mana, I'd like to go over some creatures that will work well alongside Arixmethes. First up are a few quote-unquote free casting creatures, with Ornithopter that has a 0 mana cost, and Cloud of Fairies and Peregrine Drake, with 2 and 5 converted mana costs respectively, but they untap up to 2 and 5 lands respectively, so even just untapping basic lands, they can pay for themselves. Moving on, we have Murkfiend Liege, giving other green creatures +1/+1, other blue creatures +1/+1, and it untaps all green and or blue creatures we control on each other player's untap steps, giving our creatures janky pseudo-vigilance. And for Arixmethes specifically, it gives +2/+2 and lets you use the mana dork aspect of Arixmethes on opponents' turns while still swinging on our turn. Spawning Kraken is a 6/6 that makes a 9/9 Kraken creature token whenever a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent we control deals combat damage to a player, which includes Storm Surge Kraken, which has hexproof, and, so long as we control our commander, it gets +2/+2, making it a 7/7, and lets you draw 2 cards if it's blocked. And finally, we have Nimbus Swimmer, Simic Sky Swallower, and Deep Sea Kraken, all with inherent evasion. Nimbus Swimmer is an X-cost Leviathan with flying, and enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters, so a great mana sink for later turns. Simic Sky Swallower is a 6/6 flying trampler with Shroud, making it difficult to deal with once it's on the field. And Deep Sea Kraken is an unblockable 6/6 that can either be hard cast for 10 total mana, or it can be suspended with 9 time counters for 3 total mana, and whenever an opponent casts a spell, you remove a time counter. Given in Commander you'll typically have 3 opponents, those time counters could go down rather quickly. Now let's move on to some spells that we can use to make our commander, or other creatures, more effective in combat through keywords. First up is Blade of Selves, which gives its equipped creature Myriad, where, whenever it attacks, you create a token copy of the equipped creature that's tapped and attacking for each opponent that the original creature isn't attacking. So you're basically attacking each opponent with the creature, though only one is real. and then you exile the tokens after combat. Fire Shrieker simply gives its equipped creature double strike, which would make our 12/12 commander a one-shot on any opponent if it gets through unblocked. And then we have spells like Aqueous Form and Manifold Key to make our commander, or another creature, unblockable. Aqueous Form also has you scry whenever the enchanted creature attacks. Then we have Winged Boots, Rune of Flight, and Drake Umbra, which can give a creature flying. Winged Boots additionally gives Ward 4, giving a decent amount of protection. Drake Umbra gives +3/+3 in totem armor, where if the enchanted creature would be destroyed, the aura is instead destroyed, and all damage is removed from the creature. And Rune of Flight is a cantrip which replaces itself with draw. But something else to note, it can enchant a creature or an equipment. And if you enchant an equipment, that equipment additionally grants the creature it attaches to flying. This is handy since if you have an equipment out for Arixmethes, but Arixmethes is still a land, you can still cast Rune of Flight targeting that equipment to get a slumber counter off of Arixmethes since you can't target Arixmethes as a land yet. And aside from that, we have a bunch of ways of granting trample to our creatures. Haunted Cloak gives Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, and Voric Battlehorns gives Trample and makes it so the equipped creature can't be blocked by more than one creature. Loxodon Warhammer gives +3 power, Trample, and lifelink, and Scepter of Celebration gives +2 power and Trample. But when the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you make that many 1/1 citizen creature tokens, and given Arixmethes would be a 14/12, that could potentially make many tokens. Rune of Might is an enchantment that grants +1/+1 in Trample, and like Rune of Flight, is a cantrip and can enchant a creature or an equipment. Then we have Stonehoof Chieftain, Goreclaw, Terror of Kalseisma, and Surican Goreclaw. Stonehoof Chieftain gives other attacking creatures we control Trample and Indestructible until the end of a turn, itself an indestructible 8/8 with Trample. Goreclaw, Terror of Kalseisma, makes creatures we control with power 4 or greater cost 2 generic less to cast, which does include Arixmethes since it is a creature spell, and only counts as a land once it's resolved onto the field with slumber counters. And when Goreclaw attacks, creatures you control with power 4 or greater get +1/+1 and Trample until the end of the turn. And Surican Goreclaw gives the rest of our board Trample, and creatures entering the battlefield under our control will enter with a +1/+1 counter on it and gain haste until the end of the turn. And finally, we have something a little different with Dragon Throne of Tarkir, an equipment that gives its equipped creature Defender, and when tapped with 2 generic mana, our other creatures gain Trample and +X/+X until the end of the turn, with X being the equipped creature's power. Put this onto Arixmethes, and even though Arixmethes can't swing, all of our other creatures get +12/+12 in Trample. Now let's go over some spells that can be used to either protect parts of our board, or interact with our opponent's board. Simic Charm is an instant with a few uses. It can give a creature +3/+3 until the end of the turn for a combat trick. It can give our permanents hexproof until the end of the turn to protect our stuff. Or we can bounce a target creature to its owner's hand. Then Swiftfoot Boots, Curator's Ward, and Champion's Helm can grant hexproof, though Champion's Helm needs its equipped creature to be legendary. Swiftfoot Boots also gives haste. Curator's Ward lets you draw 2 if the enchanted permanent was historic and left the battlefield. And Champion's Helm also gives +2/+2. Then we have some counterspells, including Counterspell and Decisive Denial, the former simply countering a target spell, and the latter letting you counter a spell unless its controller pays 3 generic, or we can have a target creature we control fight a target creature that we don't. And then Negate, Stubborn Denial, and Unwind can counter non-creature spells. Stubborn Denial counters a non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1 generic, but if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, it just counters the non-creature spell. And Unwind is another spell that lets us untap enough lands to pay for itself. Then we have Broken Bond and Return to Nature, which can destroy a target artifact or enchantment. Broken Bond additionally lets you put a land from your hand onto the battlefield, and Return to Nature can be used for some graveyard hate. Then Kefnet's Monument makes it so blue creature spells we cast cost 1 less generic to cast, which is handy, but whenever we cast a creature spell, we can effectively stun an opponent's creature, such that it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. And then in case the board state gets a little scary for us, we have Whelming Wave and Azuri's Predation, the former bouncing all creatures to their owner's hands except for Krakens, Leviathans, Octopus, and Serpents, and the latter making 4/4 Phyrexian beast creature tokens for each creature we don't control. Then those beasts fight a different one of those creatures, letting us wipe most, if not all of our opponent's creatures with toughness 4 or less, and likely giving us at least a few extra 4/4 beasts on our board. Now let's go over some spells that will help us with our card advantage. First up is Frantic Search, which is more card selection as it has you draw 2, then discard 2. But, like a few spells before it, it lets you untap enough lands to pay for itself. Joint Exploration is also more card selection, which, for a generic and a blue, you scry 2 and then draw a card. But you can also kick it for an additional green mana to put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. Unexpected Results isn't technically card draw, but it can be a fun cheat card or a piece of ramp. It has you shuffle your library, then reveal the top card. If it's a non-land card, you can cast it without paying its mana cost, and if it's a land card, you put the land onto the battlefield, not necessarily tapped, and you return Unexpected Results to its owner's hand so you can cast it again. Then, for some one-off draw spells, we have Concentrate and Harmonize, both letting you draw 3 cards for 4 total mana, and we have Pull from Tomorrow and Stroke of Genius, X mana cost instant spells that, in general, have you draw X cards, though Pull from Tomorrow has you discard 1. And the last one-off draw spell we have is Prime Speaker Zagana, who enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, with X being the greatest power among creatures you control. And then you draw cards equal to Zagana's power. So with Arixmethes on the field, as a creature, not a land, you could be drawing at least 13 cards. But for some draw across turns, we have Archivist, Colossal Majesty, and Snake Umbra. Archivist can simply be tapped to draw a card, and Colossal Majesty has you draw a card at the beginning of your upkeep, provided you control a creature with power 4 or greater. And Snake Umbra is an aura that gives its enchanted creature +1/+1, and, when it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. It also happens to give some protection with Totem Armor. But, now that we've gone through all of our spells, let's go over our lands. First up are Bant Panorama and Myriad Landscape. Land tutor lands, with the former finding an island or forest, for this deck since we don't have any plains, and the latter finds 2 basic lands of the same type, entering the battlefield tapped. Then we have Lonely Sandbar and Tranquil Thicket, 2 lands that can be cycled if drawn in the late game when additional mana may not be the most pressing thing. Command Tower will tap for a green or a blue and enters the battlefield untapped. And we have a reveal land with Vine Glimmer Snarl, which enters the battlefield untapped if you reveal a forest or an island card from your hand while playing it. And we also have a Pain land with Yavimaya Coast. Then for some tapped dual lands, we have Thornwood Falls, a life gain land, Temple of Mystery, a scry land, and Simic Growth Chamber, a bounce land. And for a bit of extra evasion, we have Rogue's Passage. And finally, we'll fill the rest of our decks with 12 forests and 13 islands. And now that we've gone through all of the cards in our deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see, the deck is currently ringing in a little under $45 at the time of recording, which includes our basic lands at 10 cents each, but this wouldn't include things like shipping or taxes. That all being said, I'd like to go over a handful of cards that you may wish to consider if you're wanting to upgrade this deck and are willing to give the deck a little bit larger budget. Whisper Silk Cloak can give a creature a bunch of protection through Shroud while making it unblockable, and given we don't really target Arixmethes ourselves, the Shroud should rarely be too much of an issue for us. Archetype of Imagination is another way for us to get flying, and it'll nearly ensure that we can swing through by preventing our opponent's creatures from having flying, though Reach could still block us. Oran Frostfang can make our attacking creatures scary to block as it gives them Death Touch, and can provide a hefty amount of draw. Hydroid Crassus is useful as a mana dump to make a big, evasive creature, as it is an X-cost spell, but it also lets you gain half X life and draw half X cards, rounded down, when cast. Serpent of Yawning Depths can make Arixmethes and some of our other large creatures unblockable to most decks. And An Offer You Can't Refuse and Void Slime are some great counterspell upgrades. Tooth and Nail and Defense of the Heart can be some really solid creature tutors, as they have the ability to get creatures directly onto our battlefield. And some of our best creatures happen to have big mana costs that we could avoid paying by using these spells. And the last upgrade recommendation I'd like to make is Freed from the Real. I don't normally put infinite combos into my decks, but for those who do, this card can produce infinite green mana when put onto Arixmethes. You tap for a blue and a green mana, spend a blue to untap Arixmethes, and repeat the process. But, with that all being said, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, The link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like. And if you'd like more budget commander decks, consider dropping a sub. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.